The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge across the polished linoleum of Oak Creek Memorial as Natalie Hayes moved through the pre-dawn darkness at precisely 0600 hours. Her scrubs hung 2 sizes too large, deliberately chosen to make herself smaller, to disappear into the white walls and beeping monitors that had become her entire world. She touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining before stepping into the ICU, a ritual older than the 2 years she'd been here, older than the lie she told everyone about her past. The patch was threadbare enough that nobody asked questions. That was the point. The doors hissed open. Natalie pushed a medication cart past the nurse's station where the night shift was collating charts, their voices barely audible over the ventilators and heart monitors that sang their constant chorus of vital signs. She didn't greet them. She never did. The other nurses had stopped expecting it around month 3, when they realized that Natalie's silence wasn't shyness, it was purpose. She moved with the economical precision of someone who'd learned that wasted motion was wasted life, that every step counted, that efficiency kept people breathing. Room 340 was her first stop. The patient was stable, vitals textbook normal, O2 sat at 96% on room air. She recorded the numbers in her practiced handwriting, not too neat, never too remarkable, and checked the 4 line for any sign of infiltration. The needle site looked clean. The flow rate was steady. She adjusted the rate on the pump by exactly 3 milliliters per hour, a correction that would go unnoticed by anyone except the patient's kidney function tomorrow. By 0745 hours, the day shift began filtering in like water finding cracks. Dr. Sterling arrived at 0815, moving through the ICU with the particular swagger of a man who'd never been told no in any language that mattered. He wore a Rolex Submariner that cost more than Natalie's apartment. She knew this because she'd glanced at it once and memorized the reference number, the way soldiers memorize serial numbers. His white coat had never been creased in the front, only starched to perfection at the collar and cuffs. He didn't greet the nursing staff. Greeting implied they occupied the same professional plane, and Sterling's entire presence suggested otherwise. Natalie watched him from across the ICU without appearing to watch. This was another skill from another life, the ability to track a target while seeming to focus on something else entirely. She updated the medication schedule on the computer while Sterling approached room 340, where the 4-star general lay sedated, waiting for his routine cardiac catheterization tomorrow. The man's file had arrived at 0630 with minimal fanfare, admission for pre-procedure evaluation, standard post-operative cardiac monitoring protocol, no complications listed. Natalie had glanced at his wristband the way she glanced at everyone's wristband, habit, not recognition. That's when she saw it. The tattoo. Black ink. Weathered. 2 inches above the admission for site on his left forearm, then Hayes. Her hands went still on the keyboard. The tremor started in her chest first, then migrated to her fingers, the kind of physical memory that lives in muscle, not mind. 2 seconds. She allowed herself 2 seconds of stillness, then her fingers resumed typing. Password change complete. Shift rotation updated. The moment sealed away like a classified file. She didn't approach room 340 again for 30 minutes. When she did, Sterling was already there, reviewing the pre-admission blood work on the wall monitor. He didn't acknowledge her arrival. In his presence, nurses were furniture, functional, replaceable, background noise. He was dictating something into his phone, something about the general's cardiac history, something about routine monitoring protocols. His voice carried the casual authority of a man who'd spent his entire career practicing dominance on people paid to accept it. Anticoagulant order, he said, not looking at her but clearly speaking to her. Standard prophylaxis. Enoxaparin 40 mg subcutaneous, once daily. Make sure it's documented. Natalie approached the monitor where his notes were displayed. The medication dose glowed in blue text against the white background. She read it. Processed it. Then she read it again, and her eyes registered what her training immediately confirmed: the dose was wrong. Not marginally wrong. Catastrophically wrong. A 40 mg dose for a 4-star general with his body composition and cardiac history should have been 30 mg maximum, 25 if his renal function was running slightly elevated. She'd seen his labs come through at 0630. His creatinine clearance was 52, borderline. His previous hospital records, filed in his admission packet, showed a documented heparin sensitivity. Sterling had ordered the medication that would interact with his documented sensitivity and accumulate to toxic levels in his bloodstream. The patient's daughter was sitting in the chair beside the bed. She was wearing a wedding ring and holding a coffee cup that said "World's Best Granddaughter" on the side, which meant there were grandchildren waiting for this man to come home. She was watching Sterling with the particular intensity of family members who were trying not to panic in front of medical professionals. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She hadn't slept. "Doctor," Natalie said. Her voice in public was quieter than other people's voices. She'd trained herself that way, the way soldiers train their breathing in ambush positions. Soft. Unthreatening. Invisible. The enoxaparin dose. His creatinine clearance is elevated. And his previous records document heparin sensitivity. The daughter's head snapped toward Sterling. Her hands tightened on the coffee cup. Sterling's face performed a transformation so precise that Natalie could trace its anatomy. The initial flash of surprise lasted 1.2 seconds. Then came the shift into something colder, something that looked like a smile but moved like a predator calculating angles. He turned to face her, and the air in room 340 changed its pressure in a way that made the machines beep slightly differently, as if they'd registered the shift in atmospheric threat. "Are you challenging my assessment?" he said. Not loud. Worse than loud. Conversational. The way generals speak to soldiers who've made an error. "I'm noting the lab values," Natalie said. "The sensitivity documentation. Both are in his file." Sterling moved closer to the monitor. His hand touched the edge of the screen, and his eyes tracked the medication order back to his own note signature. She watched him read his own mistake. Watched him understand it. Watched him decide what to do about a nurse, just a nurse, a woman in oversized scrubs with no visible credentials, no name badge turned the right direction, who'd corrected him in front of a patient's family. He turned back to Natalie, and she saw it clearly, the calculation behind his eyes. This wasn't about the medication anymore. This was about hierarchy. This was about a man whose entire professional existence depended on being the smartest person in the room, and he'd just had his intelligence questioned by someone he'd assigned zero importance to. "I'll adjust the dose," he said flatly. "Then, but I'll need to document that you made the observation. For the record." It wasn't a request. It was a threat wrapped in procedure language. He was going to document her correction, turn it into official hospital record, and then use that correction to prove she was overstepping scope of practice. A nurse who questioned a doctor's orders had crossed a line. A nurse who was right about it was worse. She was dangerous to the hierarchy that protected incompetence and elevated men who'd learned to sound certain. Natalie nodded once. "Of course, Doctor." The daughter was still watching. She'd understood what happened here, even if she didn't understand the full architecture of what was being constructed. She'd seen her father's life being protected by someone she'd been trained to see as background staff. Something flickered across her face, recognition, maybe. The terrible knowledge that the most important moments of care often happen in the spaces between official protocol. Sterling modified the order to 25 milligrams. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the kind of precision that comes from rage being channeled into mechanical action. He documented the change. Then, his hand still above the keys, he began typing something else, notes about the nursing observation, the timing, the suggestion that protocol had been questioned. His typing sounded like rain on hot asphalt. Aggressive. Purposeful. Natalie had already stepped back from the monitor. She was updating the 4-line, checking the site, doing the invisible work that kept patients alive. Her hands were steady. This was muscle memory from a different life, from a place where mistakes meant death and composure meant survival. Her fingers were scarred from rifle burns that she never explained and no one asked about. The skin was raised and discolored along her knuckles and the inside of her wrists, the kind of scars that came from something specific, something military, something that made her hands dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. But Sterling wasn't looking at her hands. He was looking at the monitor where he documented his decision to correct himself, and he was already composing the narrative that would justify the correction, the narrative that a careless nurse had missed something critical, that he'd caught it before implementation, that his supervision of her had prevented a medication error. His mistake would be invisible. Her competence would be transformed into insubordination. The daughter was watching Natalie's face now. Looking for something, a reaction, a confirmation, a sign that she should trust what had just happened. But Natalie's face showed nothing. This was the face of someone who'd survived Helmand Province, who'd carried men through enemy fire while rounds snapped past her head, who'd extracted a 4-star general from a compound assault and left him alive when every calculation said he should have bled out in the desert. This was the face of someone who understood that survival required that you show nothing, no fear, no anger, no recognition of the moment when someone decided you were a problem to be solved. 2 years ago, she'd walked away from all of that. She'd buried Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes under layers of silence and oversized scrubs and a job that asked nothing of her past. She'd chosen anonymity so complete that even her family didn't know where she'd gone. The PTSD from Helmand had been unbearable, the sounds at night, the weight of the men she couldn't save, the impossibility of forgetting what combat looked like when it was happening in front of you. Working at Oak Creek Memorial was supposed to be invisible. Supposed to be safe. Supposed to be the kind of life where nobody asked questions and nobody needed her to be extraordinary. She hadn't counted on Sterling. And she hadn't counted on recognizing that tattoo, on seeing the man it belonged to, unconscious in an ICU bed, the man whose life she'd changed in an instant 2,847 days ago in a compound that no longer existed, in a country she'd trained herself not to think about. She finished updating before sight. Checked the monitor readings one final time. O2 at 96%. Heart rate steady at 68. Blood pressure holding at 118/74. All the vital signs that meant a body was still working, still surviving, still waiting for the person it belonged to wake up and figure out why a tattoo on his arm was a name that belonged to a ghost. Sterling was still in the room, still updating his documentation, still constructing the architecture of what he decided was going to happen next. Natalie moved toward the door. She didn't look at the daughter again. She didn't acknowledge Sterling. She simply walked out into the ICU where the other nurses were updating their charts and the machines sang their mechanical chorus and the pre-dawn fluorescent lights continued their endless humming. What happened in the next 72 hours would change everything. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a hospital that never quite closed. Natalie sat at the small table by the window, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had gone lukewarm an hour ago, watching the rain begin its assault on Portland's November streets. She hadn't spoken to anyone since her shift started at 7. By 10:30, she'd begun to wonder if silence was contagious. Dr. Sterling entered like he owned the room. He always did. His white coat was pristine, his tie precisely knotted, and his expression carried the particular smugness of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. He moved past the refrigerator and stood directly in front of her, blocking the view of the parking lot. "Ghost," he said, his voice like a knife being drawn slowly from a sheath. "You barely exist here anyway. Might as well make it official." She didn't flinch. Didn't raise her eyes from the coffee. She simply breathed, one measured breath, the kind that comes from somewhere beneath the surface, from the part of her that had learned how to compartmentalize fear into data. The kind of breath she'd learned in Helmand Province when the world was trying to kill her. "What I mean," Sterling continued, settling into the chair across from her uninvited, "is that your presence here is becoming increasingly insubstantial. Forgettable. Like you're a ghost moving through these halls." He smiled. It wasn't a smile. "Perhaps that suits you better than actually contributing." She set the mug down without speaking. The ceramic made a soft sound against the laminate, the only response she would give him. Sterling stood and left, and the room seemed to exhale. 2 minutes later, 3 nurses entered together. They were talking loudly about the new staffing schedule, their voices carrying the false brightness of performed conversation. They saw Natalie. Without a word, without even the pretense of hesitation, they stood and walked back out. The door closed. Their laughter continued in the hallway, already moving toward the nursing station. The orchestration was flawless. It had Sterling's fingerprints all over it. Natalie remained at the table for another 10 minutes. She finished the cold coffee. She watched the rain. She thought about Helmand Province, about the way sand worked its way into everything and never quite came out, and how some kinds of persistence were worse than violence. Then she stood, placed the mug in the sink, and returned to her rounds. By noon, a new write-up appeared on the public unit board in the hallway outside the nurse's station. Her name was circled in red marker. The violation: unprofessional appearance. Scrubs improperly fitted. Reflects poorly on unit standards. Her handwriting would have been illegible with rage. His was perfect. Calculated. Deliberate. The humiliation didn't stop there. It multiplied. Around 2 o'clock, Sterling appeared at room 340. The general was conscious now but diminished, his monitor displaying the irregular rhythms of a body in distress, his eyes moving slowly as if he were trying to focus on something very far away. His daughter Rebecca sat in the bedside chair. She was in her 50s, with her father's sharp cheekbones and his watchful eyes. She looked up when Sterling entered. He gestured to Natalie, who was checking the fall line. Patient's last labs showed a potassium level of 5.2, Sterling said, his voice carrying the kind of clinical authority that made people trust him. Slightly elevated. I'd like to know what our nurse here recommends as a dosage adjustment. He said our nurse the way someone might say our intern or our orderly. Something barely qualified to speak. Natalie didn't hesitate. Sodium polystyrene sulfonate, 15 grams orally or rectally. Monitor renal function. Repeat labs in 4 hours. Incorrect, Sterling said, and his smile was a predator's smile. That's not how competent nurses do it, Ghost. Maybe you should observe more and assume less. He turned to Rebecca. I apologize. It's difficult to maintain clinical standards when you have staff with limited backgrounds. Rebecca's expression shifted. She glanced at Natalie, and there was something like pity in her eyes, pity mixed with the first threads of doubt. Natalie felt the single tear arrive before she could stop it. It came fast and hot, born from something deeper than shame, something older. She didn't try to hide it. Instead, she wiped it away with the back of her hand, maintaining eye contact with Sterling, and spoke with a voice that had suddenly dropped half an octave. I've seen what real failure looks like, Doctor. The room went absolutely quiet. The monitor continued its irregular beeping. The ventilator whispered its mechanical breath. Sterling's smile froze on his face for just a fraction of a second, long enough for everyone in that room to see that something had shifted, that he'd moved closer to something dangerous and hadn't realized it until she'd spoken. Then he turned and left, and there was nothing but the sound of the door closing and the rain against the windows. The write-ups accumulated like snow. By the end of that day, there were 2 more on the public board. By the following morning, 4. Her scrubs. Her badge placement. A notation about concerning clinical judgment gaps. Each one circled in red. Each one with her name visible to everyone who passed the station. The isolation deepened like a geological fault opening beneath the hospital floor. During her lunch shift, she sat alone in the break room again. This time no one even bothered to stand and leave. They simply didn't come in. The space around her became a kind of negative geography, a place where people didn't exist because she existed there. On the 3rd day of her probation, Sterling handed her a clipboard in front of 12 staff members during the morning briefing. You'll need my signature for every clinical decision, he said, his voice carrying the kind of false concern that was worse than open contempt. I'm sure someone with your limited background understands we have standards here. She took the clipboard. She didn't speak. The pen was already in her other hand. She'd anticipated this, the way someone anticipates the trajectory of an object falling through space. She signed her name without trembling, without breaking eye contact, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing anything but absolute composure. That night, alone in her apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant on Southeast Division, she sat on the edge of her bed and reached into the bottom drawer of her dresser. Her fingers found the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with the Delta insignia and the Latin motto that meant "We will not fail." She held it for a long time. She whispered her swim buddy's name, the one who hadn't made it home from Helmand Province, the one whose death had started her down the path to this quiet place, this anonymous life, this moment of absolute isolation in a hospital where no one knew that the woman they called Ghost had once commanded men. That she'd saved 17 lives in a single night. That she carried the weight of every person she couldn't save. She placed the patch back in her jacket and closed the drawer. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 days into Sterling's probation order, Natalie entered the ICU at 1,400 hours to begin her shift. The general's monitor told her everything she needed to know before her eyes even processed what she was seeing. The rhythms were wrong. The ST segments were elevated. His blood pressure had drifted down to 94/58, normal parameters for some patients, but for a man whose baseline was typically 118/72, it meant something was stealing his blood volume, pushing it into the spaces where it didn't belong. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis arrived in her mind like muscle memory, like her hands remembering something her conscious mind had tried to forget. Muffled heart sounds. Jugular vein distension visible even from across the room. The telltale signs of a pericardium filling with fluid under pressure, squeezing the heart like a fist closing. She paged the attending, Dr. Morrison, who was competent and careful. His response came back immediately, in surgery on another case. ETA 2 hours. She paged Sterling. He arrived 7 minutes later, his white coat still pristine, his expression already dismissive. His stable, Sterling said without even looking at the monitor closely. "Stop trying to play Dr. Ghost. His pressure is trending down," Natalie said, keeping her voice level. Muffled heart sounds. Distended JVD. Those are classic indicators of. Those are indicators that you're overtired and seeing things, Sterling interrupted. He wrote in the chart with his characteristic precise handwriting, nurse over each. Patient stable. No intervention warranted. He underlined no intervention twice. Then he left. At 16:47, the alarm screamed. The general's monitor went wild, ventricular ectopy, then bradycardia, then the terrible flat line that meant his heart had given up. His blood pressure was 62/40 and dropping. His oxygen saturation was plummeting. His daughter Rebecca had gone to the cafeteria 10 minutes earlier. The attending was still in surgery. Sterling was unreachable. Natalie stood at the bedside, and for the first time in 4 years, her hands began to shake. She could see Helmand Province behind her eyes, the dust, the copper smell of blood, the weight of her swim buddy's body as she dragged him toward the landing zone. She could see 17 men who were alive because she'd made a decision to act. Rebecca returned at that exact moment. She saw the monitor. She saw the flat line. She grabbed Natalie's arm with the desperate grip of a daughter who was about to lose her father. "Please," she whispered. The decision arrived like a trigger being pulled. Wait for authorization and watch the general die. Or perform the needle decompression, the pericardiocentesis, without orders, without Sterling's permission, in direct violation of her probation, and either save him or end her career in the process. One of those things would happen in the next 90 seconds. The general's eyes had opened 2 hours ago. That was the good news. The bad news arrived at 13:47 on a monitor screen, the way most emergencies do, silent, digital, creeping across a graph like an enemy you didn't see coming until the bullet started. Natalie was in the medication room when the rhythm changed. She'd learned to listen to monitors the way combat soldiers listen to aircraft, not with conscious effort, but with something deeper, something trained into the nervous system that doesn't require the mind's permission to alert. The atrial fibrillation started as a flutter, irregular but stable, the kind of thing that happens when 4-star generals wake up in ICUs with holes in their chests that surgeons had only recently closed. But then the pressure trended down. 89/60. Then 87/58. The respiratory rate climbed. 62 breaths per minute, then 68, the body's way of screaming that something was stealing oxygen before it could reach the vital organs. She pushed the medication cart back into the locked closet and walked toward the ICU without hurrying. Hurrying made people ask questions. At Oak Creek Memorial, Natalie had learned to move like air, present everywhere, noticed nowhere. The attending physician, Dr. Kaplan, stood at the general's bedside with his hands in his pockets. Behind him, the ICU nurse, Rebecca, one of the good ones, the kind who actually believed medicine was about patients instead of paperwork, had her hand on the 4-pole, her face doing that thing it did when the brain understood danger before the mouth could form words. The monitors sang their electronic song. 92. 81. 75. "Get me a stat chest X-ray," Dr. Kaplan said, but his voice carried the uncertainty of someone ordering tests because protocol demanded it, not because he knew what he was looking for. His hands were still in his pockets. His forehead carried the small vertical crease that appeared when doctors were afraid they might be missing something but too proud to admit they didn't know what. Natalie entered the room. She didn't announce herself. Announcing presence required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required seeing her, and seeing her meant dealing with her, and Dr. Kaplan had spent 3 days pretending she was furniture. The probation paperwork Sterling had submitted to HR had been very thorough. Insubordinate. Boundary violations. Scope creep. The word stung like a blade made of office policy, the kind of wound that didn't leave blood, only credibility damage. The general's eyes tracked her as she moved to the monitor. His name was James Holloway, decorated with medals and rank and the kind of authority that came from spending 31 years in classified operations across Helmand Province and 3 other countries the Pentagon probably never officially acknowledged. His tattoo, her name, _N Hayes _, inked across his forearm in military lettering, the kind that was permanent because the person it honored had been permanent to him, was visible on the pale skin of his wrist. He didn't recognize her. 2 years of hiding, and 5 years of searching on his end, and the universe had arranged them in the same hospital, the same room, separated by every barrier that mattered except the actual walls. BP 72/41, Rebecca whispered. The fear was leaking into her voice now, the kind of fear that came from knowing something was collapsing and not knowing which part, not knowing if the next 60 seconds would be the ones where you saved someone or the ones where you watched them die. Natalie's hand stopped shaking. This was the technical term doctors used, though doctors didn't usually get to experience it, the moment when the conscious mind released its grip on the body and muscle memory took over like a pilot engaging autopilot at 30,000 feet. She'd performed battlefield emergency procedures in Helmand Province with shrapnel scoring the walls and the smell of copper blood mixing with diesel exhaust and the sound of RPGs walking across the compound like artillery. A climate-controlled ICU at Oak Creek Memorial in Portland was a 5-star hotel by comparison. The only difference was that this time the patient had her name tattooed on his arm and had spent 5 years searching for her face. "Get me a 14-gauge needle. 18 centimeter length," she said. Not a request. Not apologetic. Just information, delivered with the kind of flat precision that made Rebecca's eyes widen and made Dr. Kaplan finally remove his hands from his pockets. "You need authorization for," he started. "Jugular vein distension. Muffled heart sounds. Blood pressure collapsing." Natalie was already moving, pulling the crash cart closer with one hand, the movements efficient, not rushed. Speed came from panic. Control came from training. Pericardial tamponade. "The chest X-ray won't arrive in time." The attending stared at her for 2.3 seconds. Natalie had learned to count time in moments measured by heartbeats and the intervals between respirations. In 2.3 seconds, the general's pressure dropped for more points. In 2.3 seconds, Rebecca's hand tightened on the 4-pole hard enough to turn her knuckles white. "Do it," Dr. Kaplan said. Natalie positioned the general at 30 degrees on the backrest, enough angle to expose the xiphoid process clearly without removing the dressings over the surgical incision. The skin was cool, clammy, the texture of someone's body already beginning to understand it was running out of time. She palpated the xiphoid process, identified the insertion point, just below and to the left, the same point she'd learned to locate during a training exercise in 2015, the same point she'd needed exactly 3 times in the field, the same point that meant the difference between a patient walking out of a hospital or getting shipped home in a flag-draped aluminum box. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid through her gloved fingers like it had been waiting for her hand specifically. Muscle memory wasn't a metaphor. It was the nervous system's ability to store procedures in the spaces between the spine and the brainstem, the places the conscious mind couldn't reach. A needle decompression was 8 steps. Identify landmark. Sterilize skin. Angled approach at 45 degrees. Advance until resistance breaks. Withdraw needle. Leave catheter. Aspirate. Listen for the hiss of air and blood, the sound of pressure equalizing, the sound of a body deciding to keep living. She'd never done this in an ICU before. Always intense with flapping canvas walls. Always with mortars walking fire across the compound. Always with the knowledge that if she made a mistake, the nearest trauma surgeon was 40 kilometers away in Kandahar. Here, if she made a mistake, one was standing 3 feet away watching her hands with an expression that looked like he was witnessing something he didn't have a name for. The needle entered just below the xiphoid process at 45 degrees, angled toward the left shoulder. The sensation was specific, skin resistance, then adipose tissue, then the pop of the pericardial sac itself, the same pop a doctor would feel if they were listening carefully enough. Natalie didn't need to listen. Her hands knew the moment by the change in pressure feedback through the needle hub. She aspirated slowly, smoothly. 50 milliliters of blood filled the syringe, dark and oxygen-rich, the color of pressure that had been building since the surgery, since the moment the surgeon had closed the chest cavity without seeing the bleeding that was happening in the space between the heart and the sac surrounding it. The kind of bleeding that killed people quietly, invisibly, with no fanfare and no warning except for the monitors singing their electronic alarm song. The general's blood pressure responded immediately. 72 became 82. 82 became 91. The respiratory rate eased. The atrial fibrillation smoothed into sinus rhythm. Regular. Strong. The sound of a heart that had just been given permission to keep working. Rebecca was crying. Silent tears, the kind that came from holding fear in your chest for 3 minutes and then having it suddenly release. She was gripping Natalie's hand, squeezing hard enough that the pressure hurt, but pain was information and information was survival, so Natalie didn't move. She just stood there, holding the 4-pole steady, watching the monitors tick back toward normal like a city's lights gradually coming back on after a power failure. That was perfect technique, Dr. Kaplan said quietly. He wasn't asking. He was confirming. He was a doctor, which meant he understood what he'd just witnessed, not luck, not improvisation, but the execution of a procedure with a level of precision that required thousands of hours of practice on bodies that mattered. Natalie withdrew the needle, capped the catheter, and stepped back. Her hands were still steady. Her breathing was still controlled. Her voice, when she spoke, was a flat instrument delivered from somewhere behind her ribs. The pericardial window will need to be larger. He'll need a pericardiotomy before he leaves the OR again. The tamponade will recur without surgical intervention. I'm calling surgery now, Dr. Kaplan said, and he was already moving, already dialing, already beginning to reverse the catastrophe that had almost happened between 1347 and 1352. That was when the light in the doorway changed. Natalie didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She'd already felt the presence the way she could feel atmospheric pressure changes, the way soldiers learn to sense threat in the space between one breath and another. Dr. Sterling stood in the ICU doorway with his phone already raised, the camera function engaged, the red recording light blinking like a tiny mechanical eye capturing something he planned to weaponize. He'd been watching the security feed. The monitors had shown the procedure in real time, the needle insertion, the syringe filling with blood, the moment Natalie had issued a command instead of a request, the moment she'd stopped being furniture and started being something else entirely. Sterling's face carried an expression that looked like hunger, the specific hunger of someone who'd been handed the ammunition he'd been waiting for. Within 4 minutes, he'd made the first call. His voice carried up through the ICU floor, audible even in the room where Rebecca was still crying and Dr. Kaplan was in the process of explaining the tamponade to the surgical team, and the general's eyes were moving between the monitors and Natalie's face, searching for something he couldn't name. "Board chair? It's Sterling." "Yes, about the incident I reported. She performed a procedure outside her scope. No authorization from the attending. Direct violation of her probation. Yes, I documented it. Security feed is time-stamped. I want it on record that this was her choice, not the hospital's." 30 minutes later, Sterling entered the ICU with hospital security and Linda Chen, the night supervisor, whose apologies carried the weight of someone who didn't want to do this but had been told the policy required it. Natalie was still at the bedside, still monitoring the general, still being Rebecca's anchor point in the chaos of a crisis that had stopped being a medical emergency the moment the needle had gone in and had become an administrative emergency instead. "You performed a procedure outside your scope," Sterling said. His voice was the texture of wound that wouldn't close, infected with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching a plan succeed. "Without physician authorization. That's insubordination. That's a violation of your probation agreement. I've documented everything." Dr. Kaplan started to speak. "That procedure saved his life. She was the only. Policy exists for a reason," Sterling continued, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face, searching for the reaction he'd been engineered to produce. "Ghost here thinks she's above it." Natalie didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain that every military medic in 3 theaters of war would have done exactly what she did, would have seen the deteriorating patient and the frozen attending, and understood that sometimes the person with the lowest rank is the one who has to hold the line. She simply looked at Linda Chen, read the apology in the night supervisor's face, and removed her badge from where it hung on her scrub pocket. The badge hit the counter with a click. Metal on laminate, the sound of one chapter closing and another one waiting to begin. The general's eyes tracked the motion. Something moved across his face, a flicker of recognition, but not her face. Her hands. The way her hands had moved, the way her hands still moved, with the kind of precision that came from carrying other people's lives through impossible terrain. She had 4.3 hours until the end of her shift. After that, she had 47 minutes until security escorted her out. And then she had the bus stop, the rain, and the cardboard box with a faded unit patch inside her jacket lining, the only object in her possession that remembered who she'd been. Her hands moved without hesitation. The needle, 14 gauge, steel sharp enough to split a hair, sat between her fingers like muscle memory had been waiting 5 years for this exact moment. The general lay at 30 degrees, his body positioned to collapse the right atrium inward, and Natalie located the insertion point with the precision of someone who'd done this in a burning Humvee at 2 in the morning. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The landmarks were written into her nervous system the way most people memorized their own address. The attending physician stood frozen 3 feet away, his hand still raised from his failed attempt at intubation. He'd been arguing about pressors, debating the merits of norepinephrine versus dopamine, while the general's pericardium filled with blood like a balloon expanding toward rupture. The man's blood pressure had bottomed out at 68 systolic. His oxygen saturation was dropping in real time. In approximately 4 minutes, his heart would stop beating because the pressure around it had nowhere left to go. Natalie didn't ask permission. She never did, not anymore. The needle went in smooth. She felt the resistance of skin, then the thin pop of penetration, then or there. The hiss of air escaping. Thick, dark blood filled the syringe like she'd just opened a valve. 10 milliliters. 15. 20. The pressure released itself into those clear chambers, and the general's oxygen saturation climbed before anyone in the room understood what was happening. 72. 78. 85. The attending finally moved. Not toward the patient. Toward the door of the ICU where Dr. Sterling stood watching from the nurse's station, arms crossed, his face wearing that particular expression of a man who'd just been handed exactly what he'd been waiting for. Sterling had spent 2 years documenting her minor infractions. 2 years building a file. 2 years waiting for her to give him something, anything, he could use to end this threat to his hierarchy. She'd corrected his medication dosages in front of families. She'd caught his diagnostic oversights. She'd made him look ordinary in a profession that rewarded arrogance as confidence, and he had the memory of a feudal lord for insult. What he didn't know was that she'd just committed a protocol violation so clean, so precise, so obviously effective that it would either make her a hero or destroy her completely. There was no middle ground. There never was. Within the hour, Sterling had made his calls. His network was extensive, board members who owed him favors, senior administrators whose daughters had married his cousins, a hospital compliance officer who understood that keeping Sterling happy was more profitable than protecting a nurse with minimal references and no professional advocates. He called them from his office with the door closed, his voice measured and reasonable, describing Natalie's unauthorized procedure with language designed to sound catastrophic. Dangerous rogue behavior. Scope of practice violation. Risk management liability. The words were carefully chosen, the implication crystal clear. She was a liability that needed to be contained before she got someone killed. Then he made the second set of calls. References. The sparse list that Natalie had provided during hiring, a clinic supervisor in Eugene who'd retired 3 years ago and was difficult to reach, a physician's assistant in Seattle who no longer had her contact information on file, an administrator from a temporary assignment in Bend. Sterling's questions were pointed and designed to elicit confusion. Had she ever acted outside her scope? Had there been any incidents? Any complaints? Any patterns of insubordination? He didn't ask directly, that would have been too obvious. Instead, he asked questions that implied problems, layering inference on top of assumption until the absence of answers sounded like confirmation of wrongdoing. By 3 in the afternoon, an outside investigator had been summoned, a compliance consultant whose job was to review credentials with the kind of impossible thoroughness that turned standard protocol into the appearance of conspiracy. They called her office and found inconsistencies that weren't inconsistencies at all, just the natural gaps that appeared when someone had lived a life designed to leave no traces. Where had she worked from 2016 to 2018? The dates didn't align perfectly with the references. Had there been a 6-month gap in 2017? Why the employment silence? Where exactly had she been? She'd been in the VA system getting treatment for PTSD so severe that some days she couldn't walk without her legs giving out. She'd been in a small apartment in Tacoma staring at walls. She'd been trying to figure out how to exist in a civilian body after Helmand Province had rewired her nervous system into something that saw threats in fluorescent lights and heard incoming mortars in car backfire. She'd been learning how to be nobody because Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes was someone who'd carried 12 people through a 3-hour firefight and one of them hadn't made it, and that was a weight that required a different kind of structure to bear. But those weren't things she'd put on a job application. The termination notice came through at 4:47 in the afternoon. Natalie read it in the HR office with a woman she'd never met before, a HR manager who wouldn't meet her eyes and kept adjusting her glasses like the paper in front of her was somehow responsible for what was written on it. Protocol violation. Unauthorized medical procedure. Scope of practice infringement. Effective immediately. The words blurred together into a single message, "You're done." She had 20 minutes to clear her locker. Security walked her there, Marcus, who she'd helped 3 years ago when his daughter came through the ER with appendicitis so acute they'd almost waited too long. Natalie had recognized the symptoms from the waiting room, had flagged the triage nurse, had held his hand while they prepped for surgery. His daughter had survived because Natalie had been paying attention when no one else was. Marcus walked beside her now carrying a cardboard box, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. The locker was exactly as she'd left it. Everything she'd accumulated in 2 years of trying to be ordinary. A cracked mug with a faded anchor that she'd bought at a Portland thrift store because it reminded her of things she wasn't supposed to remember. A dying succulent that she'd been watering for 6 months, trying to keep something alive even though she had no gift for it and the leaves kept browning at the edges. A photograph, folded, of her swim buddy Marco Reeves from her BUDS class, taken in 2009 before Helmand Province got him. Taken before she'd learned what it meant to hold someone's hand while they bled out into sand. She packed them into the box. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't need to. When she closed the locker for the last time, she slipped her hand inside her jacket and touched the unit patch sewn into the lining, the only thing she wore against her skin that remembered the truth of who she'd been. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Call sign Artemis. The woman who'd carried a 4-star general through enemy fire and never once put him down. Then she walked out into Portland rain that had arrived like a judgment, thick and relentless and absolutely indifferent to her circumstances. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. By the time she reached it, the cardboard box was softening at the bottom, the rain soaking through the corrugated walls like water through time itself. Natalie sat on the bench with the box on her lap and waited for the 24 line, watching the water bead on the cracked mug through the transparent box bottom. The succulent had tipped over. Its leaves were floating now, tiny green rafts in the water pooling at the bottom of everything she'd built. She didn't move. She didn't try to write it. Instead, her fingers found the photograph through the wet cardboard and traced the outline of Marco's face. 28 years old in that photo. Laughing. Standing in front of the San Diego waterfront with his arm around her shoulder. A man who had believed in tomorrows. A man who'd stopped believing anything the moment an IED detonated beneath his truck in a place that Americans weren't technically supposed to be fighting in. 5 years ago, she'd left everything, her commission, her family, her identity, because the weight of being Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes had become the weight of being the woman who survived when other people didn't. She'd moved to Portland because it was far enough from the East Coast that nobody would look for her there. She'd become a nurse because it was a way to keep her hands healing instead of holding guns. She'd made herself small and quiet and unremarkable because the alternative was standing in the mirror every morning and seeing a person who'd cheated death while better people fed it. The rain hammered the cardboard with the sound of applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch. And in the ICU, 3 blocks away and 5 floors up, a man opened his eyes for the first time in 3 days to see his daughter sitting beside his bed with her hand pressed against her mouth like she was trying to hold back something too enormous to contain. The general's vision was soft at the edges, his mind still surfacing from the deep place where they'd kept him sedated, but his daughter was unmistakable. Rebecca. 42 years old now. His second retirement from a life that had been nothing but deployments and separations and the particular kind of love that only existed in the space between hellos and goodbyes. He tried to speak. His throat was raw from the tube they'd had down it, but he pushed past it anyway, the words scraping out like something pulled from stone. A nurse appeared, not the one his mind was reaching for, but the hospital administrator, who'd come prepared with a photograph and a story designed to explain the gap in his memory. Standard protocol for VIP patients. Documentation. A staff photo from Oak Creek Memorial's nursing rotation, taken 2 weeks ago at a mandatory shift briefing that nobody had wanted to attend. The administrator held it up and pointed. 3rd row. Back left. Half in shadow. And the general saw her. Not the way she was now, standing in the rain at a bus stop 5 blocks away, drowning in a cardboard box. Not the way she'd become, small and quiet and designed to disappear from every room she entered. But the way she'd been in Helmand Province when she'd found him bleeding into his tactical vest with a ruptured brachial artery and 3 insurgents closing in from the north. The way she'd looked when she'd made the decision not to radio for backup, a decision that violated every protocol, every procedure, every piece of military law. The way she'd been when she'd simply picked him up, all 220 pounds of him, and carried him for kilometers through territory that wanted them both dead, her face set like stone, her voice saying only, "I've got you. I'm not leaving you." His lips moved. They shaped a word that hadn't left his mouth in 5 years. Artemis. The investigator arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 7:15 a.m., badge clipped to his belt, manila folder already open in his left hand. He didn't ask for Natalie Hayes. He walked directly to the credentialing office and said 3 words, "Dr. Sterling's file." The clerk hesitated. "Is there a problem?" "That's what we're determining." Within 2 hours, the investigator had Sterling's complete credentials spreadsheet on the credentialing director's desk. Columbia Medical School transcript. Johns Hopkins residency verification. 3 published papers on cardiac intervention protocols. A decade of continuing education certifications, all meticulously documented, all completely fabricated. The reference calls Sterling had made to discredit Natalie, the ones made to Dodd Hospital liaisons, Navy medical contacts, former colleagues at Walter Reed, those calls had triggered automatic flags. Federal flags. When a civilian physician cold calls military medical networks asking pointed questions about a senior chief petty officer's references, the Pentagon Security Office doesn't ignore it. By noon, the investigator was on the phone with the hospital board's legal counsel. By 1 p.m., that counsel was making calls to Sterling's Columbia admissions office. The transcript was real. Sterling had graduated. But the research publications he claimed, 17 peer-reviewed papers listed on his CV. Columbia had no record of him as an author on any of them. Johns Hopkins confirmed he'd completed residency but noted a gap in his continuing education between 2009 and 2014. Unexplained. Unaccounted for. The federal investigator's next call went to the state medical board. By the time Sterling finished his 2 p.m. patient consultation, the board had already opened a formal inquiry into credential fraud. By 3 p.m., his hospital privileges were suspended pending investigation. By 4 p.m., his network had disintegrated like paper burning in a furnace. The board members who'd championed him for years didn't return his calls. Not one. The golf partner who'd sponsored him at the club had his attorney contact the hospital. Dr. Sterling should retain counsel. Translation: We're done. The credentialing office sent a letter marked urgent. Sterling was forbidden from signing any charts, evaluating any patients, or accessing hospital systems while the investigation proceeded. Security appeared at his office door at 4:44 p.m. The same guard who'd escorted Natalie out into the Portland rain 3 days prior, Marcus, with 17 years at Oak Creek Memorial, stood in Sterling's doorway with a cardboard box identical to the one he'd given her. "I believe you know the way out," Marcus said. The words landed like a physical blow. Sterling's jaw opened. His hand reached toward the desk as if to object, but Marcus didn't move. He simply stood in the doorway with that box, his presence like a wall, and said nothing else. Sterling packed his personals in silence. Stethoscope. Desk photos of his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, he suspected. The framed Physician of the Year award from 2019. His hands moved mechanically, muscle memory from a career that had just evaporated. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical song, indifferent to his unraveling. He carried the box through the corridor. Heads turned. Colleagues looked away. A nurse he'd humiliated 6 months prior watched him pass without expression. Another simply closed her door. By the time he reached the parking lot, the rain had started, the same relentless Portland rain that had fallen the night Natalie sat on that bus bench with nothing but a cracked mug and a dying succulent. The hospital's attorney sat down with the board that evening. The evidence was clear. Sterling had fabricated his research credentials, misrepresented his educational background in ways that qualified as fraud, made systematic reference calls specifically designed to damage a staff member's reputation while concealing his own inadequate qualifications. The pattern was predatory, targeting someone he could intimidate, someone without institutional power, someone whose military background he'd correctly assumed would make her refuse to escalate conflicts through normal channels. The attorney recommended immediate termination and referral to federal investigators. The board voted unanimously. By the next morning, Sterling's termination was official. The state medical board's investigation accelerated. His attorney's bills began piling up like snow on the hospital's parking lot. Sterling found himself scrolling through job postings for positions that didn't require board certification: urgent care clinics in rural areas, occupational health companies, pharmaceutical consulting, anything that didn't require licensure scrutiny. None of them would hire him once word got out. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that the story was already spreading. The Pentagon's interest in why a civilian physician had inquired about a decorated senior chief petty officer triggered classified background questions. Those questions led investigators to his reference calls. Those calls led directly to his credential fraud. By morning, the case was being handled by Navy JG, not just hospital administration. 3 days later, reporters began calling the hospital. A 4-star general, recovered, coherent, verified, was being reunited with the combat medic who'd saved his life not once but twice. The general had been searching for 5 years for a woman with the call sign Artemis, someone who'd dragged him through enemy fire in Helmand Province when his internal bleeding was killing him. The hospital staff photograph had triggered his recognition. It was her. Same eyes. Same steady hands. The reunion happened in the ICU on a Thursday afternoon. Natalie stood beside the general's bed while his medical team reviewed discharge plans. His daughter, Rebecca, was there. The SEAL team leader who'd flown in from Virginia was there, standing at parade rest in the corner. The attending physician from Johns Hopkins who'd supervised Natalie's pericardiocentesis was there, having come personally to verify that the procedure had been performed correctly, which it had been, with precision that made his earlier hesitation feel like a criminal silence. The general reached out. His hand found hers. 5 years, he said. 5 years I looked for you. Natalie's eyes met his. She didn't speak. The grip of her hand was answer enough. The general said what she couldn't: you saved my life twice. Once in the mountains. Once in this hospital. I was just doing my job, Natalie said. No, the SEAL team leader said quietly. Senior Chief, you were the job. 48 hours later, the story broke on every major network. 4-star general reunited with decorated combat medic after 5-year search. The articles detailed Sterling's termination, his credential fraud investigation, his fall from institutional grace. One headline read, "Hospital physician under federal investigation after terminating decorated veteran." Another, "Cardiologist's false credentials masked incompetence for 12 years." Sterling read these articles in his empty house. His wife had moved into her mother's place in Seattle, and understood that he'd become the object lesson. The cautionary tale. The man who'd mistaken position for power, who'd assumed that someone's humility was weakness, who'd attacked the one person in that hospital who could actually survive the consequences. 6 months passed. Natalie worked part-time at Oak Creek Memorial, training nurses on critical intervention protocols. The pericardiocentesis procedure was renamed the Hayes Protocol in recognition of the fact that sometimes experience and instinct trump hierarchy. She'd started trauma counseling, reconnected with her family, let Rebecca call her Aunt Natalie's without flinching. The tremor in her hands appeared less often. She kept the unit patch visible now, sewn inside her jacket lining where it belonged, no longer hidden. The general's recovery was steady. Physical therapy through the spring. His daughter brought him to the hospital 3 times weekly. The two of them, Natalie and the general, began walking the corridors together, his hand on her shoulder, her hand steady beneath his. They didn't speak much. Soldiers understood that words weren't always where meaning lived. Sterling taught CPR certification at a community college for $38,000 a year. His classroom overlooked the parking lot. Rain hammered the windows most mornings, and he stood there watching it, watching the people coming and going, watching a life that had somehow continued without him at its center. One afternoon, Marcus appeared in the doorway of the community college. Same posture. Same quiet authority. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, the same way he'd nodded when handing Sterling his cardboard box, and walked out. Sterling understood the universe kept perfect accounts. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, Natalie stood beside the general's bed during his final evaluation before discharge. He was strong now. Strong enough to walk without assistance. Strong enough to return to active duty in a training capacity. The Pentagon had already made the decision. A 4-star general who'd been brought back from the edge of death by a decorated combat medic didn't retire quietly. His hand found hers one last time. 5 years I searched, he said again. Natalie touched the unit patch beneath her jacket lining. I had to find myself first before anyone could find me. The attending entered with discharge papers, then paused. He looked at Natalie, then at the general, then back at Natalie. Senior Chief, he said quietly, would like you to consider a full-time position. New training division. Teaching physicians that rank doesn't always come from a degree. Rebecca smiled from the corner, already taking their photo. Natalie looked at the general. He squeezed her hand. She nodded. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more videos about the quiet heroes among us. Like this video if you believe that integrity always wins. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?